The room was engulfed in deafening silence. Every eye was fixed on the altar, where the groom stood motionless, like a marble statue sculpted to perfection. The Duke of Everstone, Arthur Thorne, renowned for his unshakable temperament, was about to do something that would rattle the very foundations of English aristocracy. When he lifted his head and released a deep sigh, it became clear to all that this wedding would be remembered, but not for the reasons his bride, Lady Cecilia Harrington, had hoped. Arthur took a step forward, his wooden cane tapping lightly against the marble floor. He turned his face toward the audience, his pale blue-gray eyes staring into an undefined point in space. Though newly blind, he seemed to see more than anyone else in the room. "I cannot marry today," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall with a firmness that silenced even the most seasoned gossipers. The gasp of astonishment that followed was like the rumble of muffled thunder. Lady Cecilia, dressed in her impeccably white gown adorned with pearls, looked at Arthur as if he had completely lost his mind. "How dare you?" she hissed through clenched teeth, her mask of aristocratic sweetness crumbling in seconds. Arthur remained composed. He couldn't see her features, but he could feel the weight of her piercing glare. At the back of the church, hidden among the arrangements of lilies and whispering bridesmaids, stood Helen Brookfield, the healer hired to care for the Duke during his recovery. Her simple blue cotton dress was as out of place there as she felt. Helen wasn't supposed to be present. She knew that. But something, perhaps a hint of masochism or sheer curiosity, had brought her there. After all, the man at the altar was someone who had changed her life. And he didn't know it. 6 months earlier, Helen never would have imagined crossing paths with a duke, let alone a blind one. But that's exactly what happened when her carriage was attacked by thieves, and in a moment of weakness, she provided information to the group of criminals that led to Arthur's accident. The guilt had eaten away at her ever since. When she learned he was alive but gravely injured, she resolved to find a way to help, taking on the identity of a skilled healer. Arthur, for his part, had been an unshakable man before the accident. Ambitious, pragmatic, and at times ruthless, he carried the weight of the ducal title as if it were a second skin. But blindness had changed everything. Now every decision felt like an internal battle, an effort to balance the independence he so deeply valued with the vulnerability he never wanted to admit. And now, standing at the altar, he was about to make the most controversial decision of his life. "This is not a whim," he continued, addressing the crowd of aristocrats like a commander facing his troops. "I have been blind, not just physically, but emotionally. Today I realize that this marriage is not what I should do. And, Lady Cecilia, with all due respect, you know this as well as I do." Cecilia was furious, but she couldn't refute him. Her marriage to Arthur had always been less about love and more about power, something she had sought since her debut into society. But to be publicly rejected was a scandal she would never forgive. "You've humiliated me, Arthur," she whispered before spinning on her heels and leaving the church, her heeled shoes clicking furiously against the floor. Helen watched it all unfold, unsure if she should run away or collapse right there. She knew Arthur was blind to the outraged stares around him, but his heightened sensitivity surely felt the silent wave of judgment washing over him. Helen tried to take a step back, but before she could move, Arthur spoke again. This time, his words were meant for her. "Helen!" he called, and his voice, though firm, carried a tone she couldn't quite identify. Trust, perhaps? Gratitude? Or something deeper she didn't dare admit. "Come here." She froze. How did he know she was there? Helen moved slowly, each step echoing in the absolute silence of the church. When she finally stood beside him, Arthur reached out, searching for her presence. "You've been the only honest person with me these past months," he said, ignoring the growing whispers of the crowd. "I need you to keep guiding me, not just through recovery, but toward something greater." Helen's heart raced. She knew he didn't fully understand the extent of her presence in his life. Not yet. And at that moment, she had to make a decision, reveal the truth or accept the unknown path ahead. The sound of the church doors closing in the distance marked the end of a wedding and the beginning of something completely unexpected. Arthur was still blind, but he was beginning to see the world in a way he never imagined. And Helen? Well, Helen was about to discover that the lies we tell ourselves can be the hardest ones to unravel. As they left the church, Arthur held Helen's hand firmly and murmured, "Tell me, Helen, do you believe in second chances?" She looked at him, swallowing the guilt that weighed on her chest, and replied in a steady voice that betrayed her inner turmoil. "I believe second chances can change everything." And the truth, as always, lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The ride back to Everstone Manor was oppressively silent, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones. Arthur Thorne, the Duke of Everstone, sat rigidly in his seat, his face impassive. Helen Brookfield, seated opposite him, gripped the fabric of her skirt tightly, as if grounding herself against the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. She could feel his presence, an undeniable force that filled the small space, yet he spoke not a word. Finally, Helen couldn't bear the silence any longer. "Your Grace," she began hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wheels. "Why did you ask me to come with you? Surely, after everything, you would prefer privacy." Arthur tilted his head slightly toward her, his unseeing eyes somehow managing to convey a sharpness that pierced straight through her. "Privacy?" he echoed, his tone calm but with an edge that made her stomach churn. "Privacy is a luxury I cannot afford. I need clarity, Miss Brookfield, and whether you realize it or not, you've become the only person I trust to provide it." The words hit Helen harder than they should have. Trust. If only he knew the truth. Her fingers tightened their grip on her skirt as guilt coiled around her like a serpent. But instead of confessing, she chose the coward's path, offering a weak smile he couldn't see. "I'm honored, Your Grace," she said softly, her words a poor mask for her inner turmoil. Arthur leaned back against the seat, his expression thoughtful. "Honored," he repeated, almost to himself. "It's peculiar how often people claim that around me. Honored to serve, honored to know me, honored to stand in my shadow. But you don't flatter me, Helen. You challenge me." Helen blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Challenge? She hadn't expected that. "I only do what is necessary to aid your recovery," she replied cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Nothing more." "Perhaps," Arthur murmured. His cane tapped lightly against the floor of the carriage as he shifted. "But it is that honesty, that refusal to coddle me, that has brought me to this moment. And I need you now more than ever." Helen swallowed hard. How could he say such things, not knowing what she had done? Not knowing that it was her betrayal that had led to his accident and his blindness? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her silence seemed to fill the space between them, heavy and suffocating. The carriage jolted as it pulled into the long gravel drive, leading to Everstone Manor. Helen glanced out of the window, her gaze catching the sprawling estate bathed in the soft glow of dusk. It was a magnificent sight, one that stood in stark contrast to the shadow of uncertainty looming over her. When they arrived, Arthur stepped out first, his movements precise despite his lack of sight. Helen followed closely, her hand hovering, near his arm, but not quite touching. He didn't need her help. He had made that abundantly clear over the past few months. But the instinct to steady him, to ease his burden, was impossible to ignore. As they entered the grand foyer, they were greeted by the ever-efficient butler, Mr. Graves, whose face betrayed no emotion. "Welcome home, Your Grace," he intoned, his gaze flicking briefly to Helen before returning to Arthur. "Shall I have a dinner prepared in the drawing room?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, but first ensure that Miss Brookfield's quarters are prepared. She will remain at Everstone Manor for the foreseeable future." Helen's eyes widened. "Your Grace, that's necessary," Arthur interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I won't have this conversation again, Helen. You agreed to stay." The butler inclined his head and disappeared down the hall, leaving Helen and Arthur alone once more. She stared at him, her pulse racing, and finally found the courage to ask, "Why are you doing this, Arthur? Why keep me here when you could have anyone at your service?" Arthur turned his head in her direction, a faint smile playing on his lips. Because anyone else would lie to me, he said simply. And I've had enough lies to last a lifetime. Helen's heart twisted painfully. If only he knew. That night, as Helen lay awake in her new quarters, the weight of her secret pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. She had thought staying would give her a chance to atone for her sins, but Arthur's words haunted her. I've had enough lies to last a lifetime. How could she continue to live under his roof, knowing that her very presence was a deception? And worse, how could she ignore the growing feelings she harbored for the man she had wronged? Helen had barely slept. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains of her quarters, bathing the room in a soft glow. Her mind was a battlefield, torn between the desperate urge to confess the truth and the fear of what would happen if she did. Arthur trusted her, inexplicably, undeservingly, and she was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from shattering whatever fragile bond they had formed. As she descended the grand staircase toward the breakfast room, the hum of voices reached her ears. She paused at the doorway, her hand gripping the banister as she overheard Arthur's deep, even tone. He was speaking to someone, but Helen couldn't yet see who. I'm blind, yes, Arthur said with a clipped edge to his voice. But that does not make me weak or incapable. Anyone who thinks otherwise can leave my estate at once. Helen stepped into the room and found Arthur seated at the head of the long dining table, his cane resting against the chair. Across from him stood Lord Rupert Langley, his cousin and self-proclaimed advisor. Rupert was a man who oozed arrogance, his perfectly tailored jacket and polished boots a testament to his vanity. Arthur, Rupert drawled, ignoring the ducal title, as he often did when he wanted to appear superior. I'm merely suggesting that you reconsider. A man in your condition cannot afford to make impulsive decisions, especially regarding your household staff. His gaze flicked briefly to Helen, his thinly veiled disdain as sharp as a dagger. Arthur's head turned toward Helen's direction, his acute hearing undoubtedly picking up the soft rustle of her skirts. Good morning, Helen, he greeted, his voice calm, though the tension in his jaw was evident. It seems Lord Langley has taken it upon himself to critique my judgment. Helen offered a polite smile, though it did little to ease the discomfort crawling up her spine. Good. Morning, Your Grace, Lord Langley. She curtsied, her hands clasped tightly to keep from fidgeting under Rupert's scrutinizing gaze. Ah, Miss Brookfield, Rupert said, his tone dripping with false politeness. The mysterious curandera. Tell me, what exactly qualifies you? To care for my cousin? Aside from your remarkable timing, of course. Helen's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she straightened her back. My qualifications lie in my knowledge of medicinal herbs, experience with rehabilitation, and a desire to see his grace fully recover, she replied evenly, refusing to let Rupert's smirk rattle her. Arthur leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Rupert, he said sharply, his patience clearly wearing thin. Miss Brookfield has proven herself invaluable. Your skepticism, on the other hand, has proven exhausting. If you have no further business here, I suggest you leave. Rupert's smirk faltered, replaced by a mask of irritation. Very well, he muttered, grabbing his gloves from the table. But don't say I didn't warn you when your trust is misplaced. He cast one last look at Helen before striding. Out of the room, his boots echoing on the polished floor. Helen exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. You didn't have to defend me, she said softly, taking a tentative step closer to the table. Arthur tilted his head toward her, his expression unreadable behind the veil of his blindness. Of course I did, he replied simply. You've earned my trust, Helen. Something Rupert could never claim, even when I could see him clearly. Her stomach twisted at his words. The weight of his trust felt unbearable, like a fragile glass she was destined to shatter. But before she could spiral too deeply into guilt, Arthur spoke again. Walk with me, he said, rising from his chair and reaching for his cane. There's something I wish to discuss. The crisp morning air greeted them as they strolled through the sprawling gardens of Everstone Manor. Helen walked a step behind Arthur, watching him navigate the gravel paths, with a confidence that belied his condition. The gardens were beautiful, filled with blooming roses and meticulously trimmed hedges, but Helen's gaze was fixed solely on the man beside her. "Do you know why I chose to leave Cecilia at the altar?" Arthur asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Helen hesitated. "I could hazard a guess," she replied cautiously. Arthur stopped walking and turned his head toward her, his sightless eyes searching for something she couldn't see. "It wasn't just because she saw me as a title rather than a person. It was because for months I've felt like a stranger in my own life. Like every decision I've made has been for others, not for myself. And I couldn't bear to take another step down a path that wasn't truly mine." Helen swallowed hard, her throat dry. "That's admirable," she managed, though her voice wavered. "Admirable," Arthur repeated with a faint smile. "Perhaps. But it's also terrifying. Do you know what it's like to doubt everything you once thought you knew?" Helen's heart clenched. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur turned back toward the path, his cane tapping lightly against the ground. "That's why I need you here, Helen. I may not see the world anymore, but I feel like with you, I'm beginning to understand it again." Her steps faltered as the enormity of his words settled over her. He didn't know. He couldn't know. But his trust in her was unwavering, and it left her teetering on the edge of despair. Later that evening, as Helen wandered the quiet halls of Everstone Manor, she stumbled upon an old ledger in the study. It was a list of accounts, expenses, related to the estate, including a curious entry from the month of Arthur's accident. Her breath hitched as she recognized the name of the man who had orchestrated the ambush. Panic seized her. If Arthur ever discovered the truth behind that name, her carefully constructed facade would crumble in an instant. Helen's hands trembled as she held the ledger, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The room was dark, save for the flickering light of a single candle on the desk. The name scrawled in the neat, precise handwriting leapt off the page, as if mocking her. Edward Graves. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reread it, hoping she had made a mistake. But no, there it was, the name of the man who had led the group of highwaymen responsible for Arthur's accident. She slammed the book shut, her thoughts spiraling. Why was his name in the ledger? What connection did this man have to Everstone Manor? And, most importantly, how could she ensure that Arthur never saw this? "Helen?" Arthur's voice came from the doorway, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the book. She clutched it to her chest, spinning around to face him. He stood just beyond the threshold, his cane lightly tapping the floor as he waited for her response. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, quickly tucking the ledger behind her on the desk. She hoped the darkness of the room concealed her pale face and the guilt written all over it. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his tone calm but curious. "I thought you retired to your quarters hours ago." Helen's mind raced. I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I thought I might read something to pass the time. The study seemed the perfect place." Arthur tilted his head slightly, as if gauging the truth of her words. "You seem unsettled," he observed. "Is everything all right?" She swallowed hard, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "Yes, of course," she lied. "Just a bit restless. Nothing to trouble yourself over." He stepped further into the room, the faint light from the candle illuminating his sharp features. "Helen, you've been restless ever since you arrived." "Here," he said, his voice quieter now but no less probing. "I can feel it, even if you think you're hiding it well." Her pulse quickened. "I don't know what you mean," she said quickly, too quickly. She could tell by the slight furrow of his brow that he didn't believe her. Arthur let out a soft sigh, running a hand through his dark brown hair. "I don't mean to press," he said finally. "But if there's something weighing on you, you can tell me. I trust you." Those words again, "I trust you." They were both a comfort and a dagger, twisting deeper with every repetition. Helen forced herself to nod. "Thank you, Your Grace," she murmured. I'll keep that in mind. Later that night, Helen lay in bed, unable to close her eyes. The ledger sat hidden beneath her mattress, a damning piece of evidence she didn't know how to handle. She couldn't destroy it. Someone might notice its absence, but she also couldn't risk Arthur finding it. The connection between Edward Graves and Everstone Manor was a mystery, but one she couldn't afford to leave unsolved. As dawn broke, Helen made up her mind. She would speak to the butler, Mr. Thomas, and find out what he knew. He had served the estate for decades and likely held the answers she needed. The thought filled her with dread, but she had no choice. The truth was closing in on her, and if she didn't act, it would bury her alive. Helen found Mr. Thomas in the kitchen, inspecting the staff's morning preparations. He was an older man with a kind but no-nonsense demeanor, his silver hair always neatly combed. Helen hesitated for a moment before clearing her throat to get his attention. "Miss Brookfield," he greeted, looking mildly surprised. "Is there something I can assist you with?" She nodded, forcing a calmness she didn't feel. "I came across a name in one of the ledgers in the study," she began, careful to keep her tone casual. "Edward Graves. It caught my attention. Because, well, I thought he might be a relation of yours." Mr. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew sharper, more guarded. "Edward Graves was my younger brother," he said slowly. "He passed away some years ago." "Why, do you ask?" Helen's heart dropped. His brother. That made everything more complicated. She struggled to keep her composure. "I see," she said softly. "I didn't mean to bring up anything painful. I was just curious about the entry." Mr. Thomas studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Edward worked as a stable master here for a time," he explained, "but he left under difficult circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Helen asked, trying to sound merely inquisitive, rather than desperate. "Trouble with gambling debts," he admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "He fell in with the wrong crowd, and it cost him dearly. He never returned to Everstone after that." Helen thanked Mr. Thomas and left the kitchen, her mind reeling. So Edward had once worked for the manor. That explained his name in the ledger, but it didn't explain why he had targeted Arthur's carriage. Was it revenge? Desperation? Or something else entirely? She spent the rest of the day avoiding Arthur, unable to face him while her mind churned with questions. By evening, she found herself back in the study, poring over the ledger once more. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. As she flipped through the pages, something caught her eye: a payment made to Edward shortly before Arthur's accident. The entry was vague, marked only as services rendered, but the amount was significant. Helen's blood ran cold. Whatever Edward had been paid for, it was no small task. "Helen!" Arthur's voice called from the doorway, startling her. Yet again. She slammed the ledger shut and turned to face him, her heart hammering in her chest. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone curious but edged with suspicion. Helen forced a smile, her palms sweating. "Just researching," she said weakly, knowing her lies were beginning to crumble. Arthur stepped further into the room, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "Researching what exactly?" he asked, his unseeing eyes fixed on her as if he could see through her entirely. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. The walls around her secret were closing in, and she had no idea how to stop them from collapsing. Arthur reached out, his hand brushing the surface of the desk where the ledger lay. "Helen," he said softly, his tone both gentle and commanding. "I can't see what you're hiding, but I can feel it. Whatever it is, you need to tell me. Now." Helen's breath caught in her throat as she realized there was no more room to run. The truth was clawing its way to the surface, and she couldn't hold it back any longer. Helen stood frozen in the dim study, the ledger burning like a brand on the desk between her and Arthur. He couldn't see her trembling hands, nor the way her chest heaved with the weight of suppressed panic, but she had no doubt he could sense it. He always could. "Miss Brookfield," Arthur said again, his voice softer now, though no less resolute. Whatever you've been hiding, it's time I heard it. I've trusted you with so much. Don't make me question whether that trust was misplaced." Helen's heart shattered at his words. "I've trusted you." How many times would he say it before she broke completely? Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she considered lying again. But the ledger, the payment to Edward Graves, the lingering questions, they were all threads unraveling too quickly for her to keep up. If she didn't tell him now, someone else surely would. She exhaled shakily and took a step closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right, Your Grace. There is something I've been hiding." Arthur turned his head toward her, his unseeing eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder. "Go on," he said, his tone calm but threaded with tension. Helen swallowed. Hard, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "The accident. The one that caused your blindness. It wasn't random." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Arthur's expression didn't change immediately, but she saw the slight twitch of his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around the handle of his cane. "Explain," he said, his voice eerily controlled. Helen's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to continue. "The man who led the ambush, Edward Graves, he was your former stable master, wasn't he? He left Everstone after falling into debt." Arthur nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. "I know of Edward. What I don't know is why you're telling me this." She hesitated, feeling the crushing weight of what she was about to confess. I knew Edward," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Before the attack. I didn't know what he was planning at first, but when I found out, I was too afraid to stop him." Arthur's entire body stiffened, his cane tapping sharply against the floor as he took a step back. "You knew," he said, his voice low and dangerously calm. "You knew what he was going to do, and you said nothing?" Tears welled in Helen's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "I was scared," she cried, her voice cracking. "Edward wasn't just a gambler, Arthur. He was a violent man, and I was desperate. I didn't realize the full extent of his plan until it was too late. And after the accident, you decided to show up here," Arthur interrupted, his voice rising. "Under false pretenses. To help me, you claimed. To earn my trust." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "What was it, Helen? Guilt? Pity? Redemption?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I could help you recover, I might undo some of the harm I caused. I never meant for it to go this far." Arthur's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles white. He turned his face away from her, his expression a mask of simmering fury and disbelief. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but cutting. "You should have told me from the start. You had countless opportunities, Helen, and yet you chose to let me live in ignorance." Helen stepped closer, her heart breaking at the pain etched into his features. "I didn't mean to deceive you," she pleaded. I didn't know how to face you after everything. But I swear, Arthur, everything I've done since coming here has been to help you, to make amends." Arthur turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And what am I supposed to do with this information now, Helen? Am I meant to forgive you? To simply accept that the person I trusted most played a part in destroying my life?" His words struck like a dagger, and Helen's tears flowed freely now. "I don't expect your forgiveness," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve it, but I couldn't keep lying to you. You've already lost so much, Arthur. I couldn't take your trust as well." He was silent for a long moment, his shoulders tense as though carrying the weight of the world. Finally, he shook his head and stepped past her toward the door. "You've made your confession, Helen," he said coldly. "Now leave me to decide what to do with it." That night, Helen packed her belongings, fully expecting to be dismissed in the morning. Her heart ached at the thought of leaving Everstone Manor, leaving Arthur, but she knew she had no right to stay. She sat by the window of her room, staring out at the moonlit gardens below. Every memory of her time at the manor replayed, in her mind each one tinged with regret. She had come here seeking redemption, but instead, she had brought nothing but more pain to a man who had already suffered enough. But as Helen sat in the darkness, steeling herself for the morning, a knock came at her door. She froze, her heart pounding as she rose to answer it. Standing in the hallway was Arthur, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've made my decision." Helen's heart thudded violently in her chest as Arthur stood in the dimly lit hallway, his cane in one hand and his other resting on the doorframe. His expression was unreadable, his sightless eyes staring just past her, but his presence carried an undeniable weight. She opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Arthur entered her modest room, his movements deliberate, and stopped near the small table by the window. He reached out with his hand until his fingers brushed the back of the chair. "Sit," he instructed, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. Helen obeyed silently, perching on the edge of the chair as if bracing herself for a blow. Arthur stood before her, the faint glow of moonlight from the window casting shadows across his face. He gripped the handle of his cane tightly, his knuckles pale, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was calm. Too calm. "Do you understand the position you've put me in, Helen?" he asked, his tone devoid of the warmth she had grown accustomed to. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to place your trust in someone, only to find out that trust was misplaced?" "I do," Helen whispered, her voice trembling. "More than you know." He tilted his head slightly, considering her words. "And yet you withheld the truth from me," he said, his voice sharpening. "You let me believe you were someone I could rely on, all while carrying a secret that tied you to the very moment my life was irrevocably changed." Helen clenched her hands in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to hold herself together. "I never meant to deceive you," she said softly. I thought if I could help you recover, I could make up for the wrong I had done. You thought you could undo the past?" Arthur interrupted, his tone cutting. "But you can't, Helen. None of us can." Silence settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Helen dared to look up at him, tears pooling in her eyes. "Then why are you here, Your Grace?" she asked, her voice breaking. "If you've already made up your mind to send me away, why not let Mr. Thomas deliver the news in the morning?" Arthur's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Because," he said, his voice lowering to something almost vulnerable, "I've been wrestling with what I feel since the moment you told me the truth, and I couldn't wait until morning to say what needs to be said." Helen's breath caught, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She watched him closely, her pulse racing as she waited for him to continue. "I wanted to hate you," Arthur admitted, his voice quieter now. "I wanted to hold on to my anger, to let it justify pushing you out of my life. But I can't, because for all your mistakes, for all the lies you told to protect yourself, you've also shown me something I never thought I would see again." Helen frowned slightly, confused. "What do you mean?" Arthur took a step closer, setting his cane against the wall. His hand reached out, searching, and Helen instinctively moved to guide it, placing his palm gently against her cheek. His touch was warm, steady, and achingly tender. "You showed me trust," he said softly. "Real trust. Not the kind built on titles or power, but something far more fragile. And despite everything, I believe you came here with good intentions. That means something." Helen's tears spilled over, her chest tightening at his words. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wanted to make things right, to help you." "And you did," Arthur said, his thumb brushing away one of her tears. "You did far more than you'll ever know. That's why I've decided you should stay." Her eyes widened, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. "Stay?" she repeated, her voice shaky. You're not sending me away?" "No," Arthur said firmly. "Not yet, at least. You may have entered my life with lies, Helen, but your actions have been honest. You've earned the chance to prove that you're more than your mistakes." Helen's heart swelled with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. She reached up to cover his hand with her own, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Arthur. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do everything I can to earn it." Arthur nodded, his expression softening. "I believe you," he said. "But know this, Helen. Trust is fragile. If you betray it again, there won't be another chance." "I understand," she said quickly, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "I won't let you down." Arthur stepped back, retrieving his cane. "Good," he said simply. "Then we move forward, together." As he turned to leave, Helen felt a flicker of hope reignite in her chest. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, not with the ghosts of the past still lingering in the shadows. But for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that redemption was possible. But as the door closed behind Arthur, Helen's gaze drifted back to the hidden ledger beneath her mattress. The payment to Edward Graves remained an unanswered question, a shadow that threatened to unravel everything. If Arthur ever learned the full truth, that someone within Everstone Manor had financed the attack, his trust in her might not be enough to save them both. Helen barely slept. The ledger weighed heavily on her mind, its secrets pressing down on her like an anvil. Arthur's decision to let her stay was a mercy she didn't deserve, but his words echoed in her thoughts. Trust is fragile, and trust could shatter entirely if the truth about that payment came to light. Someone within Everstone Manor had been involved in the plot that blinded him, and that someone wasn't her. As dawn broke, Helen resolved to find answers. She couldn't let this fester. Arthur deserved to know who had betrayed him, and perhaps uncovering the truth could bring her some redemption. But she had to proceed carefully. If the wrong person caught wind of her suspicions, the consequences could be devastating. By mid-morning, Helen was in the Manor's library poring over other ledgers and records. She needed to piece together the connection between Edward Graves and whoever had made that payment. The room was quiet except for the occasional rustle of paper and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, but her focus was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Helen, her heart jumped, and she quickly closed the ledger in front of her, spinning around to see Arthur standing in the doorway. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, and though his eyes remained unseeing, they were as piercing as ever. He tilted his head as though sensing her unease. "You've been scarce this morning," he said. "Is something troubling you?" Helen hesitated, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. "No, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "I've just been occupied." Arthur's lips curved into a faint smile. "Occupied with what, exactly?" "Estate records," she said quickly, gesturing vaguely at the desk. "I thought I might be of help reviewing them. Your steward has been rather overwhelmed." Arthur stepped closer, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "That's thoughtful of you," he said, his voice softer now. "But it's unlike you to bury yourself in ledgers. What are you really looking for, Helen?" Her breath caught, and for a moment, she considered confessing everything. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she had proof. "Just trying to keep busy," she said instead, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "You've given me a chance to stay, and I want to make myself useful." Arthur seemed to accept her answer, though his brow furrowed slightly. "Very well," he said after a pause. "But you don't need to prove your worth to me, Helen. You've done enough already." Her chest tightened at his words, and she nodded even though he couldn't see it. "Thank you, Your Grace." That afternoon, Helen took a different approach. Instead of poring over ledgers, she decided to speak to the staff. Perhaps someone else had noticed something unusual around the time of the payment to Edward Graves. She began with the housekeeper, Mrs. Whitlow, who had been at Everstone for decades. "Mrs. Whitlow," Helen began, catching the older woman as she supervised the maids in the corridor. "May I ask you something about the staff records?" "Mrs." Whitlow raised an eyebrow. Staff records? Whatever for, Miss Brookfield? I came across an unusual entry while assisting Mr. Thomas. Helen lied smoothly. A payment made to Edward Graves. I was curious if you recall anything about it. The housekeeper's face darkened at the mention of Edward's name. Edward Graves was a troublemaker, she said curtly. I warned Mr. Thomas not to hire him back then, but he was insistent. Family ties, you see. Helen frowned. But this payment? Do you know who approved it? Mrs. Whitlow pursed her lips, clearly uncomfortable. I don't recall, she said finally. But if it's in the ledgers, then the approval must have come from the steward. Or higher. Higher? Helen repeated, her stomach twisting. You mean from Arthur himself? Not necessarily, Mrs. Whitlow said, lowering her voice. The late Duke, his father, still handled certain matters at the time. It's possible he arranged it. Helen felt a chill run down her spine. The late Duke of Everstone had been a notoriously shrewd man, but if he had been involved with Edward Graves, it could mean the betrayal ran far deeper than she had imagined. That evening, Helen decided to confront Mr. Thomas directly. She found him in his office, meticulously organizing documents. The steward looked up as she entered, his expression neutral, but wary. Miss Brookfield, he said. How can I assist you? Helen closed the door behind her, her heart pounding. Mr. Thomas, I need to ask you something important, she said, her voice firm. It's about Edward Graves. The steward's expression stiffened, and he set down the papers in his hand. Edward is long gone, Miss Brookfield, he said flatly. What could you possibly need to know about him now? I came across a payment made to him shortly before the ambush that blinded his grace, Helen said, watching him closely. I need to know who authorized it. Mr. Thomas's face paled, and for a moment Helen thought he might refuse to answer. But then he sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging. I suppose you would have uncovered it sooner or later, he muttered. Helen's pulse quickened. Uncovered. What? The payment was authorized by the late Duke, Mr. Thomas admitted, his voice low. But Edward wasn't hired for any legitimate purpose. The late Duke had debts of his own. He used Edward to deal with certain unsavory individuals. Helen's stomach churned. So Edward was working for the late Duke when he ambushed Arthur? Mr. Thomas shook his head. No. After the Duke's death, Edward turned on the family. He saw an opportunity to exact revenge and took it. Helen felt a mixture of relief and dread. The late Duke's involvement explained the payment, but Edward's betrayal had been his own doing. She couldn't tell if this truth would ease Arthur's pain or deepen his sense of loss. Helen left the steward's office with a heavy heart, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had uncovered the origins of the betrayal, but the question remained. Should she tell Arthur? As she wandered the halls of Everstone Manor, lost in thought, she failed to notice the figure watching her from the shadows. Someone else knew she was searching for answers, and they were determined to stop her. Epilogue: A future forged in truth. Helen sat in the drawing room, staring at the faint glow of the fire as it flickered against the stone hearth. The truth weighed on her like a millstone, each revelation over the past few days carving deeper into her conscience. She clutched her hands together tightly, the decision she had to make looming over her like a storm cloud. Arthur deserved to know the full truth, no matter how painful it would be. Footsteps echoed softly behind her, and she turned to see Arthur entering the room. His cane tapped lightly against the floor as he moved toward her, his sightless gaze fixed forward. His expression was calm, but Helen could sense the tension in his posture, the subtle stiffness in his movements. Helen, he said, his voice low but steady. You've been avoiding me. Helen rose to her feet, her heart pounding. Not intentionally, she replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Arthur tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowing. You've been quiet since we spoke last. I assume that means you've found something. Whatever it is, I want to hear it. Now. Helen swallowed hard, her chest tightening. Are you sure, Your Grace? The truth isn't easy. Arthur's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. I've found that nothing worthwhile ever is. He gestured for her to sit, then took the chair opposite her. Go on. Helen hesitated, but the determination in Arthur's expression left her no choice. Taking a deep breath, she began. I found the entry in the ledger, she said softly. The payment made to Edward Graves. It was authorized by the late Duke, your father. Arthur's face remained impassive, though his grip on the handle of his cane tightened. Go on, he said, his tone even. Helen continued, choosing her words carefully. It appears Edward was working for your father before the ambush. He was used to settle debts and deal with dangerous individuals. But after your father's death, Edward turned against the family. He saw an opportunity to act on his anger and greed, and he took it. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire. Then he spoke. So, my father's decisions set these events in motion, he said quietly. But Edward's betrayal was his own. Yes, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but it's the truth. Arthur let out a long, slow breath, his face remaining calm, though his knuckles were white against the handle of his cane. Better or worse, it doesn't matter, he said finally. The truth is the truth. It can't be changed. Helen felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I'm sorry, Arthur, she said, her voice trembling. For everything. For my part in it. For not telling you sooner. For all of it. Arthur turned his head toward her, his expression softening slightly. You could have run, he said. You could have left the moment things became difficult. But you stayed. And that counts for something. Helen's heart swelled with gratitude and relief, but she quickly reminded herself that forgiveness wasn't the same as absolution. Thank you, she murmured. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve your trust. Arthur's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time in days, there was a glimmer of warmth in his expression. You've already begun, he said simply. Days later, as Helen walked through the gardens of Everstone Manor, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves, she felt a strange sense of peace for the first time in what felt like forever. The truth was out, and while it hadn't been easy, it had been necessary. Arthur was stronger than she had ever imagined, and his resilience gave her hope that they could move forward together. Lost in thought again? Arthur's voice broke through her reverie, and she turned to see him approaching. His steps were steady, his cane barely tapping against the gravel path as he walked. Always, Helen replied with a small smile. But in a good way, I think. Arthur stopped beside her, his expression thoughtful. You've changed things, Helen, he said. Not just for me, but for this estate, this household. I see things differently now, even if I can't see it all. Helen felt a surge of emotion at his words. And what do you see, Arthur? She asked softly. He turned his head toward her, his sightless eyes seeming to look straight into her soul. I see someone who's stronger than she gives herself credit for, he said. Someone who's taught me that trust isn't about perfection, but about honesty. Someone I don't want to lose. Helen's breath caught, her heart pounding in her chest. Arthur? He reached out, his hand finding hers with ease, and he held it tightly. I'm not asking for perfection, Helen, he said. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to see where this goes, if you'll allow it. Helen's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. I'll take that chance, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Every time. As they stood together, beneath the golden autumn sky, Helen felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of belonging. Redemption, she realized, wasn't something you earned all at once. It was a journey, and she was finally on the right path, with Arthur by her side.